Okay, welcome to the week two go to session. So, this is the second of four go to sessions that we're hosting this month. I've already announced to the group that's here that, yeah, the chat still isn't working. So, I can see your comments, but you won't see what one another says, but that's fine. Okay, so don't let that stop you from making comments or asking questions throughout the session. I can always read your comments out loud so everyone can hear it, including those who watch the recording after the fact. Okay, so there are basically two sort of major issues we have to go over this week. Your first major writing assignment. Okay, so you're actually going to write your perseverance essay, the thing that you started researching last week. A quick note on that: I was out of town this weekend, so I didn't get very much done. So I'm still catching up on grading your week one weekly check-in quiz. I got to record your McGraw Hill scores real quickly, and then I'm going to really kind of burn the midnight oil tomorrow to get feedback to you on your research. Okay. We instructors aim for a 72-hour turnaround time, so that would be tomorrow at midnight. So I hope to hit that mark with your research results from last week. Remember, you had to find at least three quality articles that hopefully taught you something about your chosen role model's perseverance. Or if you struggled, remember last week I recommended you might have to change role models if you feel like you were just striking out in terms of learning about perseverance. So I'm going to be giving you some feedback on that. But now we have to turn to the actual assignment that's due this Sunday, which is the first writing assignment. So let me go to the assignment sheet real quickly, and then I'll get back to the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so here's the assignment sheet. As usual, please read this pretty thoroughly on your own, okay? Because I'm not going to spend time reading this word for word. That would be really, really boring. But a couple things I just want to point out. Also, this connects with your weekly check-in quiz for this week. One of your questions asks you to identify what audience you think you're going to be writing to. So I just want to kind of make some comments about that because it could be a little bit confusing. So excuse me. On page two of the instruction sheet, it says begin by choosing an audience, okay, for your essay, and you can choose one of three options: potential future employers, industry connections, so people who are just like you, pursuing similar goals, similar career ends, or your family, right? So that could be mother, father, sibling, spouse, what have you. You're not literally writing your essay to these people, okay? Can people hear me? Christopher is saying that he can't hear me. Can other people in the chat confirm that my voice is coming through? Okay, everybody else is saying they can hear me. So I'm going to type a quick note to who typed that? Christopher. Okay, give me 2 seconds here. Christopher. Everyone else can hear. So you might have to log out and log back in. Okay, so I just typed that in the chat. Everybody can see that. I'm going to move forward. Hopefully, Christopher can get things straightened out. Someone said I was breaking up. Yeah, that tends to happen because I just have so many things running. It usually happens while I'm scrolling, so I'm going to try to remember not to scroll and speak at the same time. But I was talking about audience, okay? So you're not literally writing to these different audiences in the sense that you're not going to write a letter like "Dear Mom" or "Dear Future Employer." The point here is that these sorts of essays that you write for class don't necessarily exist in the real world all that often. But you might want to think about who could possibly be affected if they were to read your essay. It might help you find your flow. It might help your creative juices, get moving. For example, yes, you're going to write an essay and I'm going to read it and I'm going to give it a grade. But you might want to think, when you're writing your essay, like who could potentially read your essay and be moved by it or impressed by it or see your commitment through the essay. Remember, we're trying to find connections between you and people who have already succeeded in your industry. The idea here is that, like most people, you're probably going to encounter obstacles yourself. So why not learn a little bit about this road, right? This facing of obstacles, this facing of adversity, and do so through people who have already kind of walked that path ahead of you. That's kind of the goal here. So who could be impressed by your essay? Maybe there's a family member who could read it. You read your essay and really understand. Wow, now I understand why Jane is attending Full Sail University. Or maybe it's someone who's in a similar position to you, someone who's also pursuing your career or already works in your industry. They might be impressed by what you've written. For example, if you were, I don't know, to post your essay maybe in a revised form as a blog post, or something like that, where so many people tend to sometimes participate in industry-driven writing online. Same thing with future employers. So you might want to decide to one of these audiences to sort of have in the back of your mind, like who would be most impressed, most swayed, most convinced by the words that you're writing in your paper. So one of your quiz questions asks you to choose one of these audience types and explain why, and that's really all we're looking for here. Okay, so don't get too confused. The core of the instructions for the essay are over here at the left, so make sure that you're pretty familiar with them. Okay, you're writing an essay where you'll focus on either one problem your role model encountered and three methods she or he used to solve that problem or deal with that problem. Or, and I'd say more students fall into this second option, which is you just give two or three examples of different obstacles and how your role model overcame them. It's a little bit confusing again because there's this, focus on one problem and describe three ways that the person overcame it, or focus on three different problems and one different way that they overcame it. Really, I'm just asking you to make sure that your perseverance is on the page. I'd say most people are in this second category here, where they just give two or three clear examples of perseverance. And in a second, I'm going to give some organizational tips on how you might put your essay together, depending on which one of these paths you're choosing. Okay. These next two bullet points are really important because sometimes students forget about this. In addition to discussing your role model's perseverance, you have to kind of make a personal connection to you. Okay. You have to discuss what you learned about your role model's perseverance and how you can apply it to yourself. Okay. Your future path, both as a full sail student or as an eventual industry professional. Okay. So you're discussing what you learned and how it applies to you. So don't forget to touch on that. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to move ahead. You can read through the rest on your own. For example, there's length requirements on the final page. Let me stop speaking as I scroll. Other reminders about how you have to use APA format. That you should be using Microsoft Word. If you don't have Microsoft Word, there is a free version online called OneDrive. Or you can use a different program, but make sure that you're saving it in DOC format, okay? Because it's the easiest one for me to deal with because I can actually embed comments in your essay and return it to you. That's more difficult to do if I get it in a weird, kind of odd format. But you can check out most of that on your own. Okay, so let me go back to my presentation. So let's talk a little bit more about writing the essay. First of all, because I'm still grading through your research results, did research work well for most people? Or did you encounter obstacles? Did anybody have to change role models because they just weren't coming up with great information? Or were you pretty successful in terms of finding some solid information about obstacles that your chosen role model encountered and overcame? Brian just says the word obstacles, so I'm not sure what that means, if he was successful or not. Damien said it was difficult to even find someone. Damien, did you succeed in finding someone, or are you still working on that? And other people can chime in as well. Corey says research on Steven Spielberg was quite fun and easy to find. Okay, good. Yeah, I mean, part of the secret here is the bigger the name, probably the easier time you're going to have finding information on that person. It's a little bit tougher for the people who are in, for example, mobile app design or show production or graphic design. Okay, because there are few sort of rock star people in those fields. John Miller says had a hard time finding detailed articles and not just a summary of life. Yeah, John, you mentioned in the chat before, people didn't see it, but you mentioned that this was your first live session. So if you didn't watch the recording of the first go-to session, I would watch it because I gave lots of tips on what to do with that. For example, I think it's fine to start with sort of biography type things, even though they're not allowed as research, but you can begin there to get sort of basic facts about a person's life and then do dedicated research into those specific things that you learned about. So if you learned about a certain obstacle that someone encountered through a biography, that's great, but you don't stop there. Then you try to do research into that. John says I did. I also recommended during the first session just looking for in-depth quality articles or in-depth quality interviews. You'd be amazed how many times where even if you're not looking specifically for um, obstacles or setbacks or adversity, all those sorts of keywords that if you're trying in Google or you're trying in the Full Sail Library database and you feel like you're just not getting solid results, sometimes it's just a matter of just reading as much as you can about the person. Because oftentimes, if the article is in depth enough or the interview is in depth enough, issues of perseverance raise their head. And if you truly strike out and just aren't coming up with anything, that's when I recommended maybe switching to a different person could be the solution. Okay. But let's talk about some essay foundations, organization, right? How to put this essay together. This is going to be some pretty basic stuff, so some of you might know all this already, but I'm guessing that for a lot of you it's probably at least semi new. So let's go over some organizational strategies you might use when it comes time to write your paper. So let me begin with the most common. If your role model has 2 to 3 concrete examples of perseverance, meaning you looked up, I don't know, Kanye West or Steven Spielberg or Steve Jobs or someone who's just encountered lots of obstacles or setbacks or right that it's easy to find sort of 2 or 3 concrete examples. Here's a good structure to follow. So you can take a screenshot of this, you can return to the video later and take a look at this screen. But this is sort of like a classic way to put together such a paper. Each major bullet point here is a separate paragraph. Okay, so all those orange dots, you have to imagine that they're separate paragraphs. We need some sort of introduction. Okay, this is sort of a general opening to your paper. If you can find a way to creatively grab the person's attention at the beginning, that's great. Probably in high school, you learn lots of tricks on how to do that, beginning with a thoughtful question, beginning with a surprising fact, beginning with an anecdote, beginning with an interesting metaphor. So those are all nice things. But in general, I mean, the introduction, the most important thing is to make sure that you're defining the issue, which in your case probably means that your introduction will give some general information about your role model, or maybe even the theme of perseverance. And as you can see, I've misspelled theme, so let me go ahead and fix that real quickly. Okay, right? So your opening paragraph might begin with just general comments about your role model. Maybe you narrow down to the issue of perseverance, or maybe you do the opposite. You start with the general theme of perseverance and narrow down to your role model. And typically at the end of the introduction, we have a thesis. And as you see here with the yellow bullet point, I define what a thesis is. It's a single sentence or two that typically appears at the end of your introduction. For this assignment, your thesis might be very simple. You might just find a natural way to state that your role model serves as an excellent example of perseverance, and that she or he is someone that one can learn a lot from. Okay, so we need some sort of general introduction paragraph. And then it gets kind of simple, right? You're just going to present your examples of perseverance one by one. So, for example, you might devote one paragraph to discussing that first example, discussing in detail, right? What obstacle your role model encountered and how she or he solved or dealt with that obstacle. Then you'll repeat it for 2 more paragraphs with your second example, your third example. Again, following the assignment instructions, we also have to make sure there's at least a paragraph or maybe two that explains what you learned about perseverance from your role model and how you'll apply this to your future path. And then finally, we need a conclusion where it's sort of a bookend. It sort of is the opposite of the introduction, though it's similar in some ways too, where you'll summarize your main points, and find a natural and satisfying way to bring the essay to a natural close. Okay, so pretty basic. So if you're in this category where you found 2 or 3 concrete examples of perseverance, this is a pretty good structure to follow. Now, if you're in the case where you've only found one concrete example of perseverance, remember the assignment sheet talks about you could have 3 examples of perseverance and explain how your role model dealt with it, or you could have one example in 3 different ways your role model dealt with that one issue. So if you're only finding one example of perseverance, here's a classic structure for that. It's pretty much the same, right? So we still need an introduction where we find a natural way to present your role model, the theme of perseverance, ideally both of those things. Then you'll dive right into your single example of perseverance, telling in detail the story about this obstacle or problem. And then other paragraphs can be devoted to explaining one way that your role model overcame this obstacle. Another paragraph could be devoted to a second way that your role model overcame or dealt with this obstacle. And again, you'll make sure that you're commenting on what you learned, how it applies to you, and we'll have a basic conclusion. Does this make sense? Or am I flying through things too quickly? Does anybody have questions at this stage? Brian says, yes, it does make sense. Okay, good. Others aren't chiming in. So Corey says easy to understand. Bernard says everything's good. Okay, good. And if you're confused, that's why I recommend taking a screenshot or revisiting this later if you need to remind yourself what to do. But these are pretty kind of solid structures. And listen, these are suggestions. You can play with this as you wish. So if I go back to the previous slide, for example, some students will, if you have two or three examples of perseverance, they might present one, and then immediately have a paragraph after that where the student makes the connection, the personal connection, explaining what they learned from that perseverance and how they can apply it to them. Then they'll go to their second example, follow that with a paragraph about what they learned from it and how they can apply it for them. That makes for a longer essay because you're basically following each perseverance example with your personal reaction. But you can do that if you want. So this stuff that's covered here can just be broken up into three separate paragraphs that follow your perseverance example paragraphs. There's actually a third option too. I'm not going to say much about it because it only applies to maybe two or three students out of the 75 that I have. But I also like to define perseverance as showing remarkable commitment to seeing something through. I've become kind of flexible on this because sometimes students struggle to find true obstacles or setbacks or negative things. So I'm open to the idea of perseverance also being showing just remarkable commitment to seeing a project through or getting something done. Occasionally, yeah, there are maybe two or three students who fall into that category where I just recommend that they tell that story, that commitment story, as specifically and detailed as they can over several paragraphs. But again, so many students I think fall into the category of where they do find two or three concrete examples of perseverance, or at least they find one that they can explain in detail. Okay, so if you have any questions about that, if you think you're working with someone who doesn't quite fit these structures that I'm presenting, just get in touch with me and I can offer some advice or give some direction. But these are probably the two most common forms that I see. Okay, let's move on. So this essay is due Sunday, okay? So keep that in mind too. Make sure that you allow yourself enough time to work on the essay. But now I do want to talk a little bit about research and to do so in a way that introduces the idea of APA format. Okay, so we talked about research last week, right? We covered some tips and tricks on how to do research. We talked about some do's and don'ts. I'm just going to make some quick recap points before we get into APA format. First of all, I think it's important to think of research is like joining a discussion or a conversation. Okay, research isn't just running to find something that you can throw in your paper because, oh, look, the assignment sheet says research is required, so I need to run and find something. No, ideally, research is something that you should be doing so that you're learning as much about your chosen topic as you can. Okay, and that's why I compare it to joining a discussion or a conversation. So imagine, for example, that you're attending a dinner party, okay? Not a crazy party, not a cake party, something kind of formal where adults are standing around having conversations, maybe about politics or sports or what have you. Probably you're not going to jump right in the middle of the conversation and start talking away. You'll probably approach, hang around at the edges, listen in, kind of eavesdrop, and then when you feel confident enough, that's when you'll step forward and participate. The same thing happens with research. It's kind of hard to start writing your paper if you don't know much about what's going on. And yet, people have written about, lots of your role models and how they have overcome adversity, or your role models themselves have spoken on this. So here, the equivalent of eavesdropping is you going out there and actually reading these articles, finding these interviews, finding pieces that have been written about your chosen role model, or finding the direct commentary where your role model has spoken about these issues. Okay, that's the equivalent of kind of like listening in, not jumping in and writing or speaking quite yet, but just reading as much as you can. So even though last week's assignment asked you to find three sources, and I think I said this in the week one session, but the goal wasn't just to find any three sources. The goal was to find the three best sources, and that means you might have had to read through five, six, seven different articles to find those very best three, the ones that are truly informing you about perseverance, and what your role model has gone through. If you do that initial hard work, well, first of all, I'd say that hopefully shouldn't be too difficult of work, because these assignments are designed to try to be as much in your area of interest as possible. So we're not asking you to read Shakespeare or interpret poetry, right? You choose someone you are already interested in. So hopefully the task of reading about that person and learning about them should be kind of a labor of interest, not just an academic requirement. But doing so and putting forth that hard work means that when you're ready to sit down and write the paper, you're ready to do so with kind of knowledge, right? You're not someone who's just guessing. You're not someone who's just making things up. You're someone who's writing from a position of strength. You're sort of like a mini expert on your topic. And when you can come into the writing process with that mini expertise, then the writing process just sort of becomes a lot easier, because you feel like you're an expert, because you feel like you're armed with this information. You know that you can sit down and tell this story of perseverance without many glitches. So that's why I like to compare research to joining a discussion or a conversation. If you don't join in that initial conversation, which in this case is doing that initial reading into your role model, then yeah, it becomes a more challenging task to write the essay, because then you're trying to write it and you're trying to put in research just because research is a requirement. But that's actually a bit backwards. Okay. Now, once you have your research, you have to know what to do with it, which means we have to talk about APA style. First of all, is there anybody here who's already familiar with APA style? Many people are probably maybe more familiar with MLA style because it's used in English classes when you took high school. Christopher says no. Corey says no. John Miller says 3 out of 10. Corey says MLA. Bernard says yes, somewhat. Okay, well, good news and bad news. The good news is a lot of the principles are kind of the same. It's just that the sort of nitpicky details are different. All style systems try to achieve the same thing, which is they try to lay down rules for how we handle the citing of research, okay? And APA and MLA, in that sense, really are working towards the same ends. They just have slightly different rules on how you go about doing that. So, it can be challenging if you're more familiar with MLA. Although I find that most students, even if they did use MLA in the past, they don't necessarily have those rules memorized, which is good because it shouldn't be that difficult then to learn a new style system. But yeah, let's talk in general about APA style. Okay, so let's talk about style. Not the style of this woman here, who has incredible style, right? Terrific style. No, we're talking about APA style. So when we talk about APA, we're really talking about three things. First, issues of layout and format. So this is basically just how the paper looks. So these are rules governing paragraphing, font, the inclusion of page numbers, the creation of a header. Okay, so there are specific formatting dictates that you have to follow. And then, yeah, the two other things that are more research specific, in-text citations, so what you're doing actually within your paper whenever research appears, and an end of the paper references page. Okay, in MLA it's called works cited, in APA it's called references. So let's talk a little bit about in-text citations. I'll get back to layout and format in a second. This is something, again, you might want to take a screenshot of this. Your McGraw Hill readings do cover this information. And a little bit later, I'm going to point to the many materials you have that also cover this information. This is a really kind of quick overview of in-text citations, just so you understand the gist of it. I know there's a lot of words on the page, but I'm going to try to break this down as simply as possible. First, remember that any quotation, fact, or information that comes from research needs to be cited. Okay, it needs to be cited right there and then in the paper. This applies to information that you quote directly or information that you put in your own words, but it still comes from research. Okay, that's a pretty important thing here. Some students think, oh, well, I'm not quoting something, but what they're presenting still it comes from research, right? You could never have come up with those sentences or those details on your own. Either way, whether you're quoting directly or you're paraphrasing, right? You're putting in your own words things that you've read. Things need to be cited right there and then when it happens in the paper. So let's look at an imaginary article. I've made up all these names, okay? So let's imagine this article is called The Road Leading to Tomorrow. It's written by John Smith. It was published in 2012. Okay, let's say you quote from John Smith's article directly, right? There's an awesome quote that you want to use. You have two options. And this is what makes things kind of confusing. Actually, I got to fix something real quick. Ah, come on. This was supposed to be repeated. Hold on. Come on. Okay. There we go. Sorry for that. Proofreading on the spot. But if we quote directly, we have two options. And this is part of what makes things difficult because you always have this sort of choose your own adventure. You can choose which way you want to go about handling the in-text citation. In MLA, it's much easier because there's one and only one way to handle in-text citations. APA style, you always have this buffet choice, or kind of like airlines, right? You want the chicken or you want the fish. Here you get to choose, chicken or fish, option one or option two. Both are equally valid if you're quoting directly. One way is to mention the author's name and the year in which the article was published in your sentence. Okay, so according to Smith, or you could put his full name, according to John Smith. But as soon as we mention the author's name, we immediately put the year of publication in parentheses. It's just a convention, okay? Author's name, year in parentheses. So, according to Smith, professor of education at Stanford University, it's nice to define who the person is. It's not a requirement, but if it helps your readers better understand who you're citing, you can do so. According to John Smith, 2012, professor of education at Stanford University. Then comes the quote, direct quotation. Okay, American students are underperforming in comparison to their world peers. That's our quotation. As soon as the quotation is over, we put the page number that quotation comes from. And note that the end of punctuation, okay, the actual period goes at the very end because the sentence doesn't end until the final paragraph, parentheses are closed. Some students put it here, but technically, then what's this, right? This is information that's just hanging out there. No, the actual sentence ends when everything is finished. Brian says, do you have to stick with the same option throughout the essay? No, you can go back and forth. And actually, let me give the second option, and then I'll explain. I'll come back to your question. Or you can use this method if you quote directly. You can just save everything for the end. So find your own natural way to kind of include a direct quotation. Our public schools are in trouble. According to one study, quote, American students are underperforming in comparison to their world peers, end quote. And then then we just put everything at the end. Last name, year of publication, page number. Okay, separated with commas. In some ways, maybe this is easier because if you can just tell yourself, put everything at the end, it's maybe simpler than breaking things up. But back to what Brian says, where he says, do you have to stick with the same option throughout the entire essay? No. And one of the things and this is difficult to describe, but you should sort of intuitively know which option is better. For example, how important is it to point out the name of the person in your actual sentence? If it feels like it's pretty important, if it's adding something to your sentence, then yeah, it's probably important. If it isn't so important, then maybe just having an end of the sentence citation is easier. So I know that's frustrating because I'm basically telling you, well, you'll figure it out when you figure it out, but you really will. You'll be able to kind of tell which one feels more natural, and which one feels more necessary. And actually, let me just show something real quick. Yeah, so we take the page number from which the quotation actually appears. But let's say this is an online article, right? Let's say this comes from Slate or, I don't know, Rolling Stone Online or something like that. And it's one of those articles, it's just a single page, right? You keep scrolling down to read it, but there are no official page numbers. If that happens, then we just count the paragraphs, okay? And use the abbreviation para, like that, okay? So if you find an online piece that doesn't have traditional page numbers, you just count the paragraphs. But these are the conventions: lowercase p period for page, lowercase p para for paragraph. Okay, so this is what we're doing if we're quoting directly. Now, if we're paraphrasing, okay, we're putting things in our own words, but what we're putting in our own words comes from research. Pretty much the same rules apply. There's just one thing that we don't have to worry about anymore, and that's the page or paragraph number. Okay, we can leave that out. When we quote directly, we need to identify specifically where that quotation comes from. If we're paraphrasing, we don't. So if you look at option number one, it's pretty similar to up here, okay? We can find a way to mention the author's name in our own sentence. So according to John Smith, immediately in parentheses after his name, 2012, Americans struggle not just among their national peers, they also struggle in comparison to students worldwide. Now, notice there, that's a true paraphrase, okay? It has no similarity to the original direct quote. That's another thing to be careful of. Sometimes students, they'll say, oh, I'm going to paraphrase. So, Americans are underperforming in comparison to their world. What's another word for peers? But you get what I'm saying, right? They changed an occasional word here or there, but it's still very, very similar to the original. That's not paraphrasing. Paraphrasing means you're using entirely your own language. Okay, you're saying, oh, yeah, I could quote, but I'm just going to explain what the quote says. Oh, great, that's fine. That's an option, but you need to make sure that it really has no similarity in language to the original, which is what I've tried to do here. Um, and again, I'm obviously not proofreading carefully enough. I'm not going to fix it. That should read American students struggle. Okay, and again, option number two is you can save everything for the end. So our public schools are in trouble. According to one study, American students struggle, not just blah, 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 blah. And then at the end, we put Smith, comma, 2012. Again, we don't need a page or paragraph number because we're not quoting directly. I know that's a lot of information. I know that in-text citations more than anything are probably the thing I see students struggle with the most. And I would just say it's really not that difficult. It just means spending the time and really studying the examples either from this session or from your McGraw-Hill chapters. And in just a second, I'm going to point out other materials that you have access to. And if you spend time with those documents and learn the logic behind APA, you'll find that it's not that difficult. As a matter of fact, I think APA is kind of easy. I know that shocks some students because you do receive a whopping 20 points for APA on your paper. And students will feel frustrated if they feel like they're not quite getting APA. But really, it's just a matter of taking the time to learn the rules. Once you learn the rules, it's really just a matter of chugging and plugging. It's just convention. Okay, it's just knowing that convention. For example, putting an author's last name and year in your actual sentence and then saving a page or paragraph number for the end, or just putting everything at the end. And the more practice you have doing this, the better you'll get. You actually have a couple questions on your weekly check-in quiz that cover APA, so you'll get a chance to kind of practice this before you do it for real and hand in your essay on Sunday. Okay, moving on. Some other just quick tips about like what to be careful of. First, do not photobomb your research. So whatever it is, quotations, facts, statistics, right? Anytime research appears in your essay, it shouldn't be photobombed. What do I mean by photobombed? Well, we know what photobombing is. No, when someone just either on purpose or accidentally interrupts a photo, kind of ruining it, or maybe not ruining it if it ends up being really, really funny. But that's the kind of feeling one has if they're reading a paper and then suddenly research appears out of nowhere. Okay, that's why I like to compare it to photobombing. Quotation research needs to be set up. And one way to make sure that you're doing this is something I call the sandwich technique, where we set up the quotation. That's like one piece of bread. Okay, then we deliver the quotation, which is like the meat, or if you're a vegetarian, the I don't know, the veggies or the cheese. And then we follow up the quotation with commentary. That's like the other piece of bread. And if I go back to the slide, I mean, this isn't a full. We don't see actually what comes before and afterwards. But for example, here in option number two, I mean, things are set up, right? Our public schools are in trouble. So we already know we're talking about public schools and education. According to one study. So we know that, okay, we're setting up the quotation. American students are underperforming in comparison to their world peers. I would probably also follow that with, commentary. Okay, we don't just leave things at that. And if we're setting things up and we're following our quotation, in other words, we're making sure that our research fits comfortably within the overall paragraph, we're in good shape. Okay, but if we just drop quotations in there, kind of like a little plane flying over your paper, sort of carpet bombing the paper with just quotations and facts and statistics, that seems really really abrupt. Second, avoid long quotations that speak entirely for you. Okay, we're aiming for occasional use of research to help support your points, not the other way around. Also, if a quotation is longer than 40 words, it technically needs to be put in block format, which is not difficult, but it is something you have to learn how to do. But probably you shouldn't be using quotes over 40 words, anyways. So yeah, just be careful because every so often it doesn't happen often, but I do see occasionally, just this long quotation, and it's not really functioning much other than the student just decide, oh, I found this tremendous passage. It's saying things much better than I ever could, so I'm just going to stick it in my paper. The problem, though, is that if you take out that long quote, there's really precious little of the student's own writing that remains. And that's not what we're going for. Like, I want to hear more of your writing. Yes, you've had to do research. Yes, you've had to learn a lot of this information from somewhere else, but when it comes time for you to actually write your paper, I want to hear mostly you explaining things. And yes, to sort of bolster, to sort of add credibility, yes, you should be quoting occasionally or adding aspects from your research, but they shouldn't be overwhelming your paper. So be careful of those two things. Okay, there was something that's called the references page, right? That thing you put at the very end of your paper where you list your full references in detail. So that imaginary article that I just made up by John Smith, right? I gave you basic information on that slide, the title, his name, the year, but a lot more information is needed to actually give a full reference for that person's article. Now, why do I have a big sorry picture on the page? It's because I don't have enough time or references page. It's not difficult, but there's so many different forms that your sources could take that it would be sort of impossible for me to teach them right here and now in this session. But here's the good news. I'm not blowing it off. I'm not leaving you to sink or swim. You have lots of resources. So let me get away from the presentation for a second. Okay. Oh, here we go. Okay, so this is the. Ooh, it doesn't look like I saved this. Hold on. Give me a second. Okay, let me save that real quickly, and then go back into it. Okay, good. So here's the week two assignment, right? This is the essay assignment. Composing with care. It's worth 15% of your grade. I'm going to go in preview mode so you can see what it looks like on your end. Okay, so a couple of things here. First of all, what I just highlighted, I created an APA video. Okay, I created it, I think, back in July. So I think there's one moment in the video where I actually refer to the month of July. So don't get confused by that. It just means that that's when I made this video. It's a walkthrough video. Okay, so remember, APA covers three things: layout, in-text citations, the references page. This video covers layout and formatting, and it also helps, it shows in real time how to create references. So if you just click on the YouTube link, it will take you to the video. It's a 26-minute video. But if you're someone who appreciates, I don't know if you can hear my voice coming through the YouTube. Okay, but if you, I'm going to skip around in the video real quickly. Right, so here, like, I'm showing how to create the header. Okay, if we skip along farther. Wow, my internet is really slow tonight. Come on, load. Okay, so there I am, showing you how to create the cover page. And so on. Okay, I'm not going to skip around the whole video. That's tremendously boring. Let me close this. Actually, now I'm curious. Oh, there, look. I'm creating references in real time. Okay. I was using Taylor Swift as an example because I love Taylor Swift. Okay, so if you're someone who appreciates actually walking, having someone walk you through the steps, be sure to check out that walkthrough video. And I just closed it. Let's go back into preview. Okay, so yeah, you have this APA video that I created. I think most students probably prefer this, and I created it just because I got so frustrated because I had to take off points for APA, but I also felt bad because I don't know. Um, I think if you're going to teach APA, you should really teach APA, and we do have a lot of materials, but I don't know. It's just there's something different between looking at lots of PDFs and lots of textual documents and lots of McGraw-Hill readings and trying to learn APA instead of seeing it happen visually in real time. I guess it depends what kind of learner you are. Some people probably prefer the McGraw-Hill chapters or the textual documents, while other people prefer the real time of the APA walkthrough video. But if you already know that you're that type of person who wants to kind of be walk through the steps, yeah, click on this YouTube video that I created. I've had a lot fewer problems now that I've created this video. People are doing much stronger jobs with APA, especially with layout and the references page. And text citations remain challenging for some reason. Okay, but you do have all these other documents, and most of these I have open. Okay, so let's look at a few of them. You have this PDF called APA Basics. Okay, it covers what you need to know. It's pretty in depth, so what you need to know is pretty detailed. Okay, it defines APA style and why we use it. It goes into more detail about what I kind of explained in this session, about what needs to be cited, right? Quotes, paraphrases. Again, I'm not gonna go over this whole thing, but you get a really detailed explanation. You get examples. So if this is your style, if you learn great from this, then yeah, absolutely spend. And actually, I recommend spending time with these documents anyway, just because the more you read about APA, the more you'll get it. Really, APA isn't that difficult. It's just a matter of sitting down and spending time with those materials. You also have this, which is a visual guide to what things should look like layout wise. So here's the header, and it gives you definitions about for example, all margins, top, bottom, right, and left, should be set to 1 inch, and then approximately a third of the way down, you should center the title of your document. Another third of the way down, you put this information: your name, the name of the course, the name of the instructor, the date that the assignment is due. Okay. But again, even though this visual document is incredibly detailed and tells you what to do, sometimes students would get confused because they would say things like, "Well, how do I set margins to 1 inch?" Or, yeah, great, I have this example of a header, but how do I actually go in and do that? So again, my APA walkthrough video kind of shows you how to do this. But you have so many documents, okay, the two I've just showed you, the McGraw-Hill chapters, that there's really not much excuse to get APA wrong. I'm not looking for perfection, by the way. I'm looking for about 90% accuracy. So I'm not the type of person who's going to be taking off massive points if there's a tiny error here or there. But if you just invent your own style completely, yeah, that's not good. What was the last thing I wanted to show you? Oh, okay, this document here. In addition, and I apologize because this is a strictly textual document, just because it's about in-text citations. I call it in-text citations, a concise guide, even though it's very detailed. But it goes into much more information than what I went over in this session. In this session, I gave you sort of the bare bones of what in-text citations look like and what they can do, and the two different options you have for dealing with in-text citations. But a lot of you are going to encounter situations where maybe your article has no author, or maybe it has no date, or maybe it's a video that was uploaded to YouTube, and yeah, there's a name of an uploader, but we don't know if that person who uploaded the video is truly the author. Usually it's not, by the way. So what do we do in those special situations? This in-text citations, a concise guide, covers the basics and it gets into the issues that you will probably most often deal with. Okay? And yes, it's textual, and yes, there's a lot to read through. But if you read through this a couple of times, you'll get it. And again, I use my example of John Smith. I think I changed the year to 2014. But yeah, the same examples. Okay, so you can see how things are handled. But yeah, you have all these materials to help you. So please use them. Okay, and if you're at all confused, just get back to me with questions. I'm more than happy to answer APA questions, but it's nice if I can answer those questions when you've already kind of went through the material on your own and you're struggling with it and you're confused and you have specific questions to ask me. Okay, great. Now, speaking of specific questions, we've actually reached the end of the session. So, are there any questions? Preguntas. I know we've covered a lot. We've covered the essay. We covered some organizational strategies for how you could put your essay together. We covered APA. I always get nervous during this session because we cover so much. Reese says good here. Christopher says negative. I think he means negative, the question of if there are questions or not. John has an off-topic question. That's fine. I'll field any questions. For people who are comfortable with what we went over, you are allowed to go ahead and enjoy the rest of your evening. But for those who want to ask questions, I'm going to hang around for a few minutes, okay? So thanks to the people who showed up. Remember, we'll do it the same time, same place, next Tuesday. Donald, you're welcome. You're welcome, Bernard. People are just randomly typing thank you. Okay, you're welcome, Corey. Oh, John says, I'll read it for everybody. What's the best way to get in touch with the class? He's working on a portfolio project and was wondering how he could ask the class if anyone is interested in working on a joint effort. Um, that's a good question. I have this ability through the message system, but maybe you don't. Like if I send a message, okay, I click on the envelope icon and I click on messages. And I compose a message. I don't know why it takes so many clicks to go. Like I have the ability to write just about everyone in your class. Do you not have the same options? Is that an instructor only feature? Because one way you could reach out to everybody is with a message that goes out to everybody, but maybe that's only instructor specific. I don't know if students are given the ability to email the entire class. Because otherwise, I don't know. We used to have like a general discussion board here for people who wanted to just make off-topic comments or off to have off-topic conversations, but so few people used it that we just kind of eliminated it. So I would look into the messaging option. That might be the best way. Ooh, just about everybody's left the room. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and end the recording because I'm not sure other people need to. It looks like questions are slowing down. So for the people who are watching, I'm gonna stop the recording now.